Good morning. Well folks, it's Monday the 25th of January 2021 and it's time for Mythbusters episode 23 with me, DaviePHD. Many things are said about Scotland, independence, the Union, the EU, etc. In these videos I bust the myths that many people believe. This week we deal with the myth that the UK is now in its third COVID lockdown. The COVID-19 pandemic was the very birth of this vlog. I had started to record my observations of the UK government's mishandling of it and wanted a platform to share my findings and make sure it wasn't just me. It wasn't. Now many of us are scunnered with coronavirus restrictions, and rightly so. We all just want this to be over so we can get back to our lives. Many people are questioning if lockdowns work at all. This is the third one we've tried after all, and despite the vaccines, things don't seem to be getting better at any kind of pace. But for lockdowns to work, they have to start. And the UK has not had a lockdown yet. At least not a proper one. Whilst we all bitch and moan about tiers, levels, hand sanitisers, wearing masks, etc. because, well, I'm not really sure why, some other countries and their citizens have been doing this right. I'm going to relay to you the experience of a Brit who arrived in Australia in October. He was only allowed into the country as he's married to an Aussie. I'm married to an Australian. I returned to Australia from the UK in October. This is my experience of what happened to me when I arrived in the country during COVID. I think it will help people understand how criminally bad our government's response has been. On arrival, passengers were escorted from the plane by armed police. We were allocated a government-mandated hotel and told to wait in a holding area. Once processed, we were led to a coach. Members of the Australian Army lined the route to make sure no one tried to escape. Once at the hotel, we were taken off the coach one by one. An Australian police officer escorted me to my room, telling me in no uncertain terms that if I left any unauthorised circumstances for the next 2 weeks, I would be spending up to 2 years in an Australian prison. During the next 2 weeks I was fed 3 times a day on polystyrene plates with disposable plastic cutlery. Below are some examples of the food. It was fine, but there was no choice or control. After about 8 days I was tested for COVID-19. This was mandatory and the first time I'd seen another human since the quarantine started. Even though I was negative, I was told I could leave only once my 14 days of isolation were over. Having come from a world of masks, social distancing, constant wariness, walking out into Australian life in Queensland was genuinely startling. No one had masks on. Shops and restaurants were all open, and though people were being careful, it was like going back to pre-COVID days. Sure, Australia still has COVID cases, but when they do, they're usually people still in quarantine, and when they're not, immediate, decisive action is taken by state premiers to close state borders in order to localise the infection, even when this is extremely unpopular. Now, 2 months later, living in Australia, where life is pretty much back to normal, I watch my country from afar and get angrier and angrier. Britain is an island nation, just like Australia. Just like COVID-free New Zealand, it's a massive advantage in a pandemic. Britain had the chance to protect its citizens from this virus by closing our borders at an early stage and putting anyone who entered the country into mandatory quarantine. Instead, we, the UK, allowed thousands of people to enter the country with barely a question. It's still happening. Australia and New Zealand have shown that decisive, positive action, however unpopular, is the way to beat this virus. Instead, our government prioritised avoiding international friction for business and the economy by keeping our borders open. There's no one to blame for where we are now but Johnson and his government. He chose not to close our borders. He chose not to test and isolate those entering the country. He chose to continue to allow people to enter Britain without any idea how healthy they were after they arrived. The difference between the COVID-safe life Australians enjoy and where we are in Britain is down to one thing: leadership. That the UK had a PR man interested only in personal optics in charge at this time of crisis will surely go down as one of our nation's greatest tragedies. Powerful words, aren't they, folks? And having listened to that guy's account and lived through what is happening here in the UK, I now don't even believe we've had one lockdown yet. Especially not 3. If you want to see the difference between the UK's leadership and competent leadership, just watch this.
There were some countries who initially talked about herd immunity as a strategy. In New Zealand, we never, ever considered that as a possibility, ever.
And it's important to recognise it's not to stop everybody getting it. You can't do that. It's not possible to stop everybody getting it. And it's also actually not desirable because you want some immunity in the population.
Herd immunity would have meant tens of thousands of New Zealanders dying, and I simply would not tolerate that, and I don't think any New Zealander would.
Perhaps you could sort of take it on the chin, take it all in one go and allow the disease, as it were, to move through the population.
We currently have 102 cases, but so did Italy once.
We're not doing the things that sometimes perhaps are happening elsewhere just because it seems like a popularist thing to do.
But the trajectory is very clear. Act now or risk the virus taking hold as it has elsewhere.
Things like closing schools and stopping big gatherings don't work as well, perhaps, as people think.
We have, for instance, 9 million protective masks already here in New Zealand, should we need them.
Reports that some NHS trusts are running out of protective equipment has caused huge concern.
Due to shortages, we would now have to share masks.
We're still and will continue to track and trace every single one of those cases. We know where they came from, what links to overseas travel, who those individuals were in contact with. So that if someone in that contact group then has COVID, we can continue to trace the line of how people came in contact with it.
People were transferred from hospitals into care homes to release pressure on hospitals, but without being tested first. So they were, in effect, carrying the COVID-19 into places where there were lots and lots of vulnerable people.
Every person entering New Zealand will be required to self-isolate for 14 days. These are the toughest restrictions in the world.
Still today, you can continue to fly into the UK with no checks, no measures, no screening, no tests and no quarantine.
Apply a simple principle. Act like you have COVID-19.
I was at a hospital the other night where I think there were actually a few coronavirus patients, and I shook hands with everybody.
Because we believe that decisive action, going hard and going early, gave us the very best chance of stamping out the virus. And it has. We have done what very few countries have been able to do. We have stopped a wave of devastation.
Because I know there will be many people looking now at our apparent success.
Britain is on track to record one of the worst coronavirus death tolls in Europe.
Look at the advice given by Jacinda Ardern to New Zealanders in March 2020, when they had just 102 cases, to act as if you have COVID-19. The UK government only issued that advice in December 2020, once things here were immeasurably worse. When you consider for the first 93 days of the UK COVID pandemic that the UK government let 18 million international arrivals land in the UK at all our airports, without as much as a health questionnaire or temperature check, then compare that experience of arriving in the UK with the narrative of being escorted off a plane by armed police in Australia. In the UK, people were being asked very nicely if they wouldn't mind staying indoors for a couple of weeks, but in Australia, they were having to do so under armed supervision with no choice of where you stayed and the threat of 2 years in jail hanging over you if you didn't comply. It's easily seen that in comparison, we haven't had a lockdown in the UK. We've just been convinced that we have. Going hard and early, prioritising society before economy, has actually paid off handsomely for Australia and New Zealand. In comparison, the UK government has, as per usual, put the economy before society, and now look where we are. As Australians are now enjoying an almost normal COVID-safe existence and New Zealanders enjoy life COVID-free, our Prime Minister's government is only now 10 months in and 97,939 deaths later, just starting to give some of the advice that New Zealand and Australia gave right at the beginning. And incredibly, they're only now considering the kind of border controls that have brought Australia back to semblance of normality and has brought New Zealand back to being COVID-free. Boris Johnson and his government have failed us in every conceivable way. It was their choice not to close our borders. It was their choice not to test and isolate those entering the country. It was their choice to allow 18 million people to enter Britain with no screening of any kind. It was their choice not to participate in EU procurement for medical equipment. It was their choice to outsource everything they could, and it was their choice who it was outsourced to, which was mostly their friends and party donors, however badly that service was delivered. It's scarcely any wonder at all that people are running around saying masks and lockdowns don't work. This government's incompetence has not only armed anti-mask and anti-lockdown tinfoil hatters with ammunition to support their claims, it has failed to protect the economy it was designed to protect, and it has doubly failed to protect the public, who really should have been the first fucking priority. I'm often told that the comparison between New Zealand and the UK is an unfair one, as the UK is a much larger, a much more important nation than New Zealand. But look at this picture and tell me, apart from our size, what is so different about us? I know what the most glaring difference is. It's in the leaders they choose. The difference between a leader concerned about saving the maximum amount of people versus one concerned with protecting the maximum amount of his friend's cash. But this is an independence blog, I hear you all say. Well, the similarities between Scotland and New Zealand should be quite obvious. An independent Scotland would be so similar in New Zealand that you'd have to use our accents and maybe their success at rugby to tell us apart. We share a population size, we're similar in industries, economy, culture and terrain, and with compassionate, competent women leading each nation. Indy, Scotland, fully in control of our own destiny, would likely be politically similar to New Zealand. We would have been empowered to make similar decisions to keep our people safe, rather than look after rich people's money. Unlike the UK, which thinks it is for some reason exceptional, we would have been quite happy to copy other people's homework and copy good practice from more successful nations. Now, anybody who knows me will know that I hate Fitbar with a passion. But there is one area I wish was more like Fitbar. I wish there was a January transfer window for world leaders, and we could see a headline like this. Hopefully soon we'll get the chance to promote Nicola Sturgeon to world leader status. But one thing is certain, Boris Johnson needs relegating, and fast. It's just not tenable to defend him anymore, saying that he's doing his best. He's not a potty training toddler who we can all forgive when he accidentally shits himself. He's supposed to be a world leader, in charge of one of the world's allegedly great nations. And he sought that position, though he probably thinks in his head it was somehow his birthright. But when Boris Johnson acts too late and misses the potty, it's not a case of wiping his arse and telling him he'll get it better next time. Because when he shits himself, people die. It is that serious. The only way he can even partially redeem himself now is to order a proper New Zealand-style lockdown, and then, once it's had the desired effect, resign forthwith. Folks, thanks for watching. Please feel free to share this video with anyone you like. DaviePHD.